Hello. Thank you so much for joining and taking the time to be here. My name is CJ Tremblay. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm joining from Vancouver, Canada, which is on the unceded and stolen territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. That is really central to a lot of the work that we do here. As you know, our focus on climate justice and the working groups that we have to support that is in large part, specifically in Canada, where I live and work, is the people contributing to the climate crisis are not the people who are being harmed by it the most. And in Canada specifically, that's sort of the Indigenous community. And I just wanted to take a second to recognize that and set that context for a lot of the discussion that we're going to have today. I'm the vice chair of the CANIE Global Board. I'm one of the founding members. And I'm super happy to be today's moderator. We've got a great session. It's a little bit about what the day looks like. Got a 90-minute session, and we're in the housekeeping stage right now. I'll share some information about CANIE, which you can see on the screen, and we'll talk about Climate Action Week and our sponsor. Then we'll go over some context of the CANIE Accord, so everyone in the room has sort of that understanding, similar level of understanding that we're working with. And then we're going to jump right in. You're going to hear directly from some of our signatories, and we do want to have an interactive session, so we would encourage anyone to ask questions. We'll keep an eye on the chat. Ine and Tulia are here, some of our volunteers, and we'll also open it up at the end. If anyone has any questions, you can unmic yourself and we'll sort of unmute yourself, and we'll just have a time. So just to go back about CANIE for a second, we're a strictly volunteer-run organization. It came together for our first ever event in 2020. And since then, we've grown so much. And it's because of our volunteers, our sort of participants who come to all of our events, and everyone who is participating really is sharing in our vision for a reimagined international education sector that reaches net zero emissions by 2030. This is a big, bold, ambitious group. We believe that international education practitioners are sort of the people who are best suited to solve this problem. And we are really excited to make a platform, and we're even more excited to have been recognized for it in the last couple of years, with having received the EAIE President's Award in 2022 and having been Pioneer of the Year finalist twice. So I just wanted to, with that context, say thank you so much to everyone who's joining us, everyone who's watching this after on YouTube, and anyone who has sort of given their time and energy and ideas to CANIE over the last several years. So now it's exciting because we are in CANIE Climate Action Week 2023. And this is our first ever Climate Action Week in April. We used to have these summits about once a year, but increase the frequency of these events because there's increased urgency, there's increased demand for information and knowledge sharing and having a platform to sort of share ideas. And so we're super excited. So on to sort of the next slide, that this week is action-packed. There's so much happening, a couple live podcast events, really talking about some interesting topics around climate action in our sector. And most importantly, there will be opportunities to connect, be inspired by, and learn from fellow professionals during this interactive sort of chapter meetings and networking events. So we would encourage you to make sure that you're able to attend those networking events that are happening over the course of the week. And then last but not least, before we get into the CANIE Accord, just want to recognize the Climate Action Week sponsor, Alethea Global Cooperative, which is, as you can see, a worker cooperative that is providing consulting services to decarbonize international education by focusing on equity-centered climate action. Their services include what you can sort of see on the screen there, and of course, they're proud signatories of the CANIE Accord. So the website is alethea.global, that's ALETHEA.global, and we will link to the website at some point in the chat. So that's great. We are keen to get started today. We had an earlier session earlier today. So this is Zach and I's second session on the Americas time zone. We are The first session was super engaging, the chat was, as I said earlier, popping lots of action, lots of questions, lots of people answering each other's questions. So we're really keen to facilitate and make that a space and to have a lot of really good conversation today. But we're not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time on the CANIE Accord itself. If you want to learn specifically about the deep details of the Accord, I would encourage you to check out the presentation from our last Climate Action Week in November. It was really a fantastic overview of what the CANIE Accord is, a bit of context as to the urgency of the climate crisis and why we need to sort of take action now. And so we're going to drop that link in the chat for you as well, and it will be on YouTube in the sort of show notes so that we can encourage you to really dig into that evergreen content. That said, before we jump into the conversation, I do want to just highlight a couple points about the Accord. So we've all got that basic framework. And then I'll also ask Pitulia and Ine on the chat to drop links to the CANIE Accord document, like the web version, so that as we talk about different articles, you can go in, the principles and articles, you can sort of go in and also follow along or like touch base and look at that as we talk about some of those elements today. So thank you, Pitulia and Ine, for keeping things moving forward. So first things first, CANIE Accord is a program or sort of framework that has been developed for international educators by international educators. This is our sector's response to the climate crisis. And signatories have to agree to 3 principles. They have to agree to take immediate action because we are in the face of a climate crisis. We have to collaborate, innovate, and educate. And then the 3rd principle is to develop climate solutions that advance social justice. So all of the elements of the CANIE Accord are underpinned by these 3 critical principles that will sort of facilitate the ability to take action on the different parts of the Accord. So that's sort of just table stakes. You have to agree that there's an urgent problem, we've got to take action immediately, that this is not business as usual. Collaborate, innovation, like the new way of doing things is kind of going to be required. And then making sure that we're not repeating mistakes of the past and that we're providing solutions that that center climate justice. Now, CANIE signatories have to commit to at least 5 actions across 3 different articles or sections of the Accord. And there are 5 sections altogether and a total of 70 actions. So you can choose 5 of those 70 actions across 3 different categories to be able to sign on to the Accord. So those sections are leadership and influencing, emissions accounting and reduction, travel, facilities, operations and procurement, and climate education. Each of those things, you'll hear me when I talk to Joe and Zach later, talk about like, this is one of the better actions or one of the basic actions or one of the best. That's because each action has been categorized as either basic, better, and best. Now we know that it's not like a perfect document, but we wanted to get it out there and we didn't want to let perfection get in the way of taking action. This is something that we're going to continue to update. We're going to increase its ambition. We're going to increase its scope because there are parts of the sector and dimensions of the sector that just haven't been included yet, but we are working on it and we've had a really great response so far. So with that in mind and that context sort of all shared, I did want to focus on sharing the experience of CANIE signatories so that you can learn, be prepared, and sort of join our guests today as signatories of the CANIE Accord. That is my unabashed objective, is by the end of this to get more signatories to the CANIE Accord, and doing that by having and sharing stories of and processes of our signatories. So we've got 2 service providers today. We've got IDP, who committed to 30 actions, and from IDP is Jo. She is the group manager of sustainability at IDP. She was appointed to this newly created role in April 2022. So happy anniversary. And her goal was to drive the organization's sustainability agenda to the next level. In the first 12 months, Jo has sought to elevate the climate conversation within IDP, moving beyond emissions reporting to firm commitments, including signing the CANIE Accord. So Jo, we're so glad she's here, is a respected senior sustainability professional with more than a dozen years experience in the sustainability sort of leader across a range of industries. And that's what's really interesting. And I'm keen to dive into this a little. Experience from waste management and manufacturing to telecommunications and finance. So that's really exciting. Jo, thanks so much for being here. Really looking forward to sort of digging in a little bit more. Now, Zach, joining us from ICEP, also made 30 commitments to committed to 30 actions in the CANIE Accord. And Zach, in addition to this having been his second session today, is the Director of Member Relations for the United States at ICEP Study Abroad. And Zach also chairs the ICEP Sustainability Task Force, which we're going to hear about later, and has made signing the CANIE Accord one of ICEP's first signature actions on sustainability and climate change. I love that for ICEP. I love that for CANIE. I said that this morning. I'm saying it again. And so prior to this role at ICEP, Zach served in a variety of international education positions in Michigan, Oregon, Arizona, and Washington State. So thank you so much to the both of you for being here. Please say hello to everyone in the audience. Zach and Jo, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, Zach, I've jumped in before you. I guess before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I'm joining you from, which is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I extend my respect to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. Thank you for having me. This is my first CANIE presentation, and also my first panel presentation representing IDP. So as CJ said, I am quite new to the industry, so keen to learn from all of you as well.
And I'm really thrilled to be here. I know we had like CJ said, we had a really dynamic discussion earlier today or last night, depending on where you are. And looking forward to hopefully having a dialogue at some point during this from folks who are here. Love to hear your questions and thoughts as we go along.
Great. So we are going to get into it. So some of the commitments that both of your organizations have made are similar and universal to all types of signatories, right? Institutions, association, conference providers, and service providers. I really think that this discussion today is going to be super applicable, but recognizing that you're both either service providers or a service provider and conference provider, I think that I just want to let everyone know that if you are an institution, we want to hear sort of your experience as well in the chat. I think this is really going to be valuable and add to the discussion. So if you're willing to share, we'd love to hear that. And also that the discussion this morning was 2 service providers and 2 institutions. And those institutions aren't messing around. So there's going to be lots to learn from. Big, ambitious, and bold objectives, I think. So it's really exciting stuff. So just the big question from the jump, you're both with associations or organizations that have signed on to the CANIE Accord. And I'm curious to hear what it was that made you want to sign the CANIE Accord. And then in your answer, if you could let me know or let us know how you came to learn about the CANIE Accord and sort of what your first impression was of it. And what was the driver for you as an individual within your organization to move this forward? So Zach, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, CJ.
All right.
I first became aware of the CANIE Accord when there was the initial kind of rollout presentation. I believe it was one of the very first ones, maybe 2 years ago, announcing the CANIE Accord, and that was open for signatures. Our president, John Lucas, had actually been part of some of the initial dialogue around the scope and the crafting of the document, as far as I'm aware. And so we both attended that initial session and took some time, but we got to the point where we did decide to sign. And the idea that we as an organization could have kind of some guiding scaffolding for the work that we could be doing around sustainability was really critical and key, and helped push me towards thinking about, we want to be a sustainable organization. We have a lot of folks who are excited about that topic. How do we get there? And that gave me something to kind of present to both our executive team and our staff as one of the earliest things that we could view as seen as some things that we already are doing. And then there's some things that we want to be doing. Let's use this as kind of a guiding set of principles for us moving forward. And so that was really what got me interested in moving ICEP towards signing the CANIE Accord, is really identifying that it would actually be able to help us kickstart that drive that a lot of our staff actually have in this area.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. And Joe, would love to hear from you.
I think for me, learning about the Accord was through other people in IDP who have obviously closer connections to the industry, and they obviously were very keen to take more action, I guess, regarding climate change, but didn't have necessarily the subject matter expertise, which is why my role was created to begin with. So as soon as I started, I had a lot of people contact me through the business and say, have you heard about CANIE? You should meet with ALSA or someone from CANIE to talk about the Accord. This is something that IDP should be part of. And I guess for me, when I did actually read through the Accord, what struck me the most was about the collaboration. So coming from other industries within Australia, that is the biggest thing at the moment, that people within industries and sectors are coming together and saying, what can we do as a collective as opposed to an individual organisation? So, for example, my previous organisation was in superannuation, and we were part of the investor group on climate change, which is trillions of dollars of investor money, which can make a big difference on where they choose to invest. So I think that for me, it was the collaboration part, and I made it one of my KPIs to develop a business proposal to take this to the global leadership team.
Perfect. So thank you so much. Now I'm going to, so that's a very different experience. So hearing Zach say, oh, this was brought to me from the president of my organization, and you saying, okay, well, I have to create a business case. I'm keen because we know that there can be sort of obstacles and barriers to moving things forward. And I'm sort of keen to understand from you, Joe, what you, when it came to making that business case, and did you come across any sort of skeptics in moving that forward?
Yes, I think I did. I did find some people who probably didn't necessarily see the benefit and thought that what we were doing was enough, which it is. And I think that's kind of how I presented the case, that a lot of the actions within there were things that we were already doing and things that are probably likely to be on a plan that I would put forward in the next 12 to 18 months anyway. So I think that got a few people across the line, but also the fact that it changes the conversations with our students, with our partner institutions. It's a way of collaborating beyond the service that we provide. So I think that that really got some people excited that it could be something new that we haven't yet tried before.
And when it came to moving this forward and through the sort of executive leadership team, the global leadership team, apologies, who were your critical allies along the way? How did you sort of get through that? Because to your point, like, yes, you were empowered and they made this position for making an impact, but you came across some people who didn't see it. So who were your critical allies along the way and sort of changing that conversation?
So we have a really good corporate responsibility committee made up of 4 members of the global leadership team, myself and a few other senior leaders. Those were my critical allies. So if I could get things across at the committee and have it endorsed, I'd already had half of the global leadership team endorse the program or endorse the proposal. So that was probably the first hurdle. And once that hurdle was achieved, I have the chief operating officer, the chief financial officer, the head of investor relations, and the chief people officer on my side, which are probably 4 of the major players within the executive team.
Cool. Thank you for that. And then Zach, I wanted to ask you as well, when it came to moving this forward, I know you mentioned the sustainability task force earlier, so I'm wondering if you could talk about the actual process of, because it was brought to you by your president, but what did it look to actually go through and get buy-in?
Yeah. Even though John is really invested in this topic and was part of that initial outreach, we weren't in a position where he was just like, yeah, we're signing it. We had to kind of decide to put together a proposal, and I had to make a business case as well to our executive team, our president and vice presidents, to articulate what the value of this would be, because of the staff time that's involved with committing to the CANIE Accord. So we're a small nonprofit. We're about 35 people, give or take, at any given time, spread out from our offices in Arlington all around the world as well. And we tend to have quite a lot on our plates, each individual staff person in their role. And so when we are thinking about how can we follow through signing the CANIE Accords and what needs to be done, and even the formation of the Sustainability Task Force, I had to go to our executive team with a business case. And so I talked about a few things. I talked about staff retention, because sustainability issues are very important to a lot of folks that work for ICEP, and it adds a little bit more meaning to the work that they're doing. And so we saw that as a real value add potentially to folks, and maybe keep them a little bit longer. We talked about this next generation of students wanting to see, and all the research showing that they want to see large organizations, institutions, companies, organizations, many of which they've lost a little bit of trust in, focusing on areas of sustainability. And so there's a real imperative for us to kind of follow where the market's going in that regard, but also it aligns with our mission as well. So being able to make that dual case, where talking about the mission-driven aspects of our nonprofit organization with the kind of market-driven needs of our students that we're working with, as well as the staff that we're trying to retain, which I'll stereotype a little bit. A lot of the younger staff are the ones that are coming together on the Sustainability Task Force, that are volunteering their time to focus on this. Those were two areas in which we were having to kind of make the case organizationally to have this happen, because it's opportunity cost. The staff time working on sustainability, it's going to that, not potentially somewhere else. And so those were conversations that I had to have with our executive team, and thankfully they agreed with all the arguments that we were making. And then the Sustainability Task Force was formed, and then that's when we took a look at the CANIE Accords. And one of the beautiful things about the CANIE Accords, in most organizations and universities, I would say, there are some things you're probably already doing. So it was nice to go through, and I had the entire task force break up and look at it individually from their point of view as a single individual, and come back and say, these are the things that they think we're doing already, and these are the things that they want us to do. And so that's what we did. We kind of came together, and surprisingly, our lists aligned almost universally. And so then that's what I took to the executive team, saying, we, as a group of 9 to 10 folks, see that this is what we were already doing, and this is what we would like to do moving forward, and then got their buy-in sign off through that process.
Great. And I love hearing that, because it's really nice to hear you say, which is something that Joe alluded to earlier, that there's stuff that you're already doing that meant you could sign on, or that you were already planning to do and were able to sign on. So I think that's really great. I just wanted to take a beat and say, if anyone wants to share any barriers that they may have in face of moving this forward, what their specific barriers, what your specific barriers might be, I'd encourage you to share them with us, because this is a sort of knowledgeable group. Sounds like there's a couple business cases that convinced some executives to move forward, and sort of hearing Zach say that, like, employee retention is such a powerful thing. And I know it's interesting because Zach, you mentioned 35 or so people at ICEP, and Joe, there's something like including the global offices, like thousands of employees at IDP.
6,500, I think we're at. Yeah. And I think maybe the key difference between Zach and I is that IDP is also ASX listed. So we have the investor push as well. We get a lot of questions on ESG more broadly, and sustainability, and what we're doing and taking action. So I guess I had that more so than the employee retention as part of my business case.
Can I ask you, Joe, the investor pushing you towards seeing what you're doing in sustainability, is there also a counter push on that? Like, is that where funds should be, or resource should be going, or is it really almost universally positive in trying to push the organization forward on sustainability?
I think, yeah, CJ and I discussed a little bit about this in a catch-up. We talked about the concept of materiality, which is something that I've done in the last 12 months. So for an organisation this size, there are a lot of ESG topics that impact our strategy, impact how we're going to go and continue to grow moving forward. So we went through quite a comprehensive process to determine what were our material ESG topics. Climate change was there, however, it wasn't in the top 5. But it is what we call hygiene. You have to do it. And I think that question around what were investors expecting, they're expecting us to do something. How ambitious that is, we're still not sure. They just want to see more information. What is your scope 1, 2, and 3? What targets have you set? how do you govern, and how do you make strategic decisions with climate in mind? You know, what's the board's role in all of that? So I guess, yeah, the conversation right now is, what are you doing? Tell us more. We haven't had the direct push yet to say you need to set a target and you need to reduce emissions.
Okay, thank you for asking that question and sort of sharing that response. And I remember sort of also being surprised when you mentioned that it wasn't a top concern. And of course, we're always pulled in so many different directions, but very rarely when I have these conversations personally myself, do I hear someone like, yeah, it's not one of our like top priorities. It's not the most material part of our organization, but it's hygiene or like table stakes, or we just have to do it. Otherwise it's like preventative, because otherwise we're going to be facing these bigger risks in the future, right? Like risk mitigation pieces. So that's really, it's always wonderful to have people share that perspective and share sort of openly in this community that you just kind of like got to do it and find a way to make it work. And now there's some interesting conversation happening in the chat and I love it. And P. Tulia asked a question about employees well, not asked a question, but sort of mentioned employees driving positive change in other organizations as well beyond international ed. But sometimes staff is also a barrier and not wanting to change, doesn't see the value. So there's plenty of support and training required. And I think that that is a very astute observation. And I think it's particularly relevant to international education, which is a sector where, you know, common dialogue and conversation was airline status, the road warrior mentality. And so I do think that that's a really interesting part of it. And I did want to recognize also the Douglas in the comments talking about sort of the potential future requirements for reporting around the CANIE Accord. And while I can't speak forever to CANIE, I can say something that was brought up earlier in the earlier discussion around the CANIE Accord being just, you know, stuff we're already doing, and that future reporting from CANIE is, and I think that Joe, actually, you mentioned a little bit about this in our previous conversations, where like timelines and reporting requirements were loose right now because we are a volunteer-run organization, and the lack of required timelines and sort of necessary reporting beyond posting sort of an action plan was an item you could choose to do as one of the pieces, was both a limitation of the CANIE Accord, but also like a benefit where it didn't have to be a whole association, a whole organization that signed on. It could be, and this was mentioned, I think, by the team at Lewis and Clark College in the first session, where specifically they weren't able to really move it up the entire institution, but they were able to say, this is the scope of influence that I have, and I'm going to sign the CANIE Accord as my international department, and I'm going to work and collaborate and learn from my sustainability team, but we are going to sign off, and this is as big as I can control, and so within my sphere of control, this is what we're going to do. So I did want to remind everyone that the CANIE Accord can be signed specifically within a set part of an organization. So if an international office is keen to engage, and we've seen examples of institutions who are leading the way by the international office, who are leading change in the institution. And I think that that's really wonderful and a great opportunity to sort of start and then show the effectiveness of signing on to the CANIE Accord. And, you know, in hopes that like those reporting requirements will not be so cumbersome. I mean, CANIE really is interested in making the barrier to engaging here and making those commitments and just working towards improvement needs to happen sort of sooner rather than later. And I would sort of invite, if anyone else, particularly, I know P. Tulia, you're involved in this work as well, but like we want to make sure that it's really about getting started. And then we don't want to make these things so cumbersome that no one wants to do it anymore. We're also very sensitive to like greenwashing. This is not what it's meant to be. It's meant to be sort of a genuine engagement by the people who want to sort of lead in this space to make an impact and sort of almost raise those table stakes, right? So we are partners in advancing this work. So yeah, but I think that that's a really wonderful question and a super valid fear about the future reporting scheme requirements. I think that there is a lot of general anxiety about that. And Joe, you could probably speak to that better, having existed in a space for sustainability in the last
the
12
reporting,
years.
Yeah, ESG or sustainability reporting is onerous, you know, in general, and particularly for listed organisations. But Douglas, I think you've raised in the chat there about it being an internal anxiety that there were no reporting requirements, and that's exactly how I saw it. So I saw it as a risk to the business signing up to Accord that did not have a reporting requirement or timeframes. And I saw it as a risk for the reason of reputational risk. So you're saying you're signing up to something, but you've got nothing to demonstrate for it, and there's no requirement for you to demonstrate through reporting. So I think we've committed to reporting against our actions each year through our annual report. And it doesn't have to be, as CJ says, it doesn't have to be a great big beautiful, perfectly designed document. It could just be, here's a table, here's the steps we've taken this year against each of these actions, and putting that somewhere where it's publicly available. In other spaces like the UN Global Compact and things like those really big accords or things that you can sign on to, there are onerous reporting requirements. You've got to do it once a year. You've got to do it to exacting standards. And so I understand that it is a challenge, but it is also a reputational risk that it's not there.
And Joe, thank you for sharing that perspective. I think that, we definitely recognize that, but we are also and I would invite anyone from CANIE to sort of share in the chat, because I don't want to speak entirely on behalf of everyone, but my understanding at the moment is very much that we just want people to start taking action, and that ours is not designed to be an onerous program. What we want is people to sort of reimagine the way, so those three principles around taking immediate action and collaborating and innovating and centering, equity-centered climate action is really sort of that sweet spot of where we want to be working. So I really appreciate sharing that barrier. And what I really appreciated about one of the institutions from this morning, Lewis and Clark, was that they said, you know what? If our sustainability team doesn't want to be involved, or if there's other people that we can't get sign off on at the president, because it's just like the process is going to take too long, we can sign off on it with the scope that we have now. And this is going to be something that I'm going to be accountable to. And that was sort of a really inspiring piece that I hadn't necessarily had someone come out and say it like that. As much as we have said, like, yeah, you can absolutely do that. We don't require like a president's signature. What we require is someone who's going to be the point person to move this forward. Okay, well, that was exciting. Thank you for bringing up, that's a really important topic, and for sharing those perspectives. And, when it comes to reporting, there are numbers. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, because now all sections of the Accord, I believe, are equally weighted and are significant to the future, but I will say that what is most urgently needed is a reduction in emissions. And what I love about this panel and want to dive into a little bit more are some of the commitments in Article 5 around emissions accounting and reduction. Now, both IDP and ICEP committed to establishing a baseline year. And what I wanted to ask and sort of share with everyone here is, and I'll ask Zach first, and then Joe, I'd love to hear from you, did you already have, when you signed on to the CANIE Accord, did you already have that baseline set in place? Like, had you already figured it out? And if not, and you're working on it, how's it going?
We did not, CJ, and that's the beauty of the CANIE Accord. Again, it gives us a guidepost to move forward with some of these ideas, and the reporting requirement, I think, is also one of the benefits here. If we do end up having an imperative to actually show some results, there's someone checking our work in a way, right? There's a reason we need to be doing this to be able to report. So it gives us kind of some structure around that. We were not capturing our CO2 footprint from a business perspective. We were talking before the session a little bit about the scope, and this would be another thing I would say about the reporting requirement piece is we have 2,000 plus students going all over the world, international to international, US to international, international to the US. And we could potentially try to tackle what that carbon footprint is of all the students going all our multilateral exchange programs, but that's not really within our capacities right now. So we want to focus on what we could, I don't want to say control, but what we could measure with any real accuracy, and that's our business travel and our business practices. And so that's what we're going to be attempting to do this upcoming year, which is assess our carbon footprint for all business related travel for the upcoming year. And that's going to be our baseline moving forward. And the idea is to then reduce it 10% year over year after we kind of know what that baseline is, because you'd be throwing darts at a wall if you wanted to try to, guess how we're going to reduce our carbon footprint. If we don't actually know what we're doing, that baseline year is so critical to really getting that started. And it gives people something to measure. If you have that baseline and then you were to kind of carve out that pie or that cake for each department or each individual in their scope of their work, you could, even in a smaller level, say, okay, you as an individual reduce by 10% and measure that. And we're going to try to create some deal of reporting that's going to be simple and easy for folks to do. But it helps try to make it something that's a little bit more, not digestible, but something that's a little bit easier to chew, something that's a little bit easier to kind of take and say, okay, that's actually something I can do myself to try to reduce my carbon footprint by 10%, as opposed to trying to see this as this abstract, let's just do this as a concept organizationally. And I think that's where that reporting requirement comes in, and thinking about, okay, what can we do? What's reasonable? What's something that we can bite off that is something that we can manage is an important thing to consider here.
Thank you for sharing your journey. And I am delighted. It's always really nice to hear that sort of the CANIE Accord has inspired you to do this thing that you may or may not have done. And now you have this framework in order to move that forward. I think that's really great. And that you're just like working through it. Haven't figured everything out, working through it. We're committed to it. And I think that that's really great. And I know that Joe and I talked a little bit about like that leap of faith. And I think we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I did want to ask Joe, because I actually don't know the answer to this. They say, don't ask the question you don't know the answer to, but I don't know the answer to this. And that is, did you guys already have a baseline emission in place before signing on to the CANIE Accord?
Yes, we did. So prior to me starting at IDP, they would had already started the work to measure scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And yeah, Zach, I completely agree. Like it's an investment of time, money, and we had to use consultants to do this work for us because it's so detailed, using the greenhouse gas protocol, which is an international standard, and then also using some elements of a climate active standard, which is an Australian standard as well. So that work was already done, and we measured our first full year. So we actually measured our first full year of scope 1, 2, and 3 for FY21. But when I looked at that data and then did FY22 data, we reset the baseline year to 22 because 21 was still not a full year. We were still, parts of our network were still in lockdown. It was not an ordinary year for travel, business travel. So we reset that to 22.
Okay, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. And you've both alluded to, and specifically Joe talked about scope 3, because you both committed to Article 18, which is sort of measuring just about everything that's relevant to you. And also specifically IDP signed on about differentiating scope 1, 2, and 3. And I'm wondering, Joe, if you can tell us a little bit about the decision, and then Zach, like why or why not including sort of scope 3 emissions as part of that. And just a quick overview in terms of scope 1 and 2 for those who are joining us, whereas scope 3 emissions are really the consequences of the activities of the company, but they occur from sources that are not like owned or controlled, unlike scope 1 and 2. And so that's a huge part of the work and travel tends to be in, and a really interesting part of the discussion that I know we're going to get into, but I'm keen to hear sort of why, yes, you committed to scope 3. Sorry, Joe, if I could get you to answer that question. And then Zach, because that was something that I didn't sign off on, and that's okay. Like, it's really interesting and important for us to hear why or why not on certain pieces.
Yep. I think for IDP, it goes back to the expectation of our stakeholders. Being such a large organisation, it is an expectation that we are measuring scope 1, 2, and 3. As a listed company, we're being pressured to do TCFD reporting, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and that requires scope 1, 2, and 3 reporting, which is why they were already on that journey prior to me starting at IDP. I think you wanted me to talk a little bit about what's in the boundary and scope of scope 3 for us. So it is 86% of our total emissions is scope 3. The three biggest sources within scope 3 itself are electricity from hired facilities, staff travel, and our procurement of goods and services. So they are probably about 90% of scope 3 of those three categories. Using the greenhouse gas protocol when you're doing this work and sort of saying what's in and what's out of your scope, we determined that student flights were not within our scope because of the service that we provide. That's not within our operational control. So, we fly 40,000 students around the world as well, Zach. So they're not within the scope of our emissions accounting for now.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that that's a really interesting discussion. And I think when you previously shared, you was like, oh, we had a really intense conversation about like our responsibility and where that sits. And there's a very real, and before you joined the pre-meeting, we were having a chat about this, and it was like, where do student emissions sit, right? Is it with the institution that's granting and saying, we are influencing the students to go abroad because it's credit or not, and so there's what does that look like? And there's concern that it might be double or triple counting because who's counting it? We haven't figured that out yet in our sector. But I appreciate you sort of clarifying what is the scope of your scope 3. And at the moment, it does not include student travel. And there's some really interesting conversations happening at institutions about who does that sit with? And so thank you for sort of providing some insight on there. And Zach, you guys, so at ISUP did not commit to scope 3. And I just wanted to, if you could share why, because I think it's really important for.
Well, scope, there's the idea of capacity, and there's the idea of the momentum that I wanted us as an organization to garner before tackling something that was a little bit bigger. If there's, for example, a disabled car and you start pushing it, it's really hard right at the beginning to get any kind of movement on that car. But once all four wheels are turning, like that effort is a lot easier. And so that's kind of where we are at ISUP right now. We're a smaller nonprofit. We wanted to tackle a lot of these. We signed off on 30 pieces of the CANIE Accord here, but we wanted to really focus on the things that we could, in theory, measure accurately and measure within the scope of our staff's abilities and time. And so once we start doing those things well, then we can start expanding the scope of the work that we're doing and the commitments that we're making. But for now, the areas that we have the biggest impact on are, staff travel and business operations. But also, if we're trying, I would rather right now for us to do something really well, like student education, programming, promotion of sustainable travel, than trying to measure all student carbon emissions as part of our annual kind of report, because I don't think we could probably do that very well at this point. I think we could do the communication, the education a little bit better. And if we only have so much staff time, again, there's opportunity costs and there's trade-offs in trying to make these. And I don't want to say that, don't, strive for perfection, but don't let perfect be the enemy of good or great here. And as a small nonprofit, that's kind of where we landed. It's like, what are the things that we can measure? What are the things that we can control? And what are the things that we can do well? Let's grab those low hanging fruit and kind of get that momentum going on the effort as a whole, and then see where we go from there. That was really our philosophy.
I think that's wonderful. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone got to hear your sort of reasoning behind that. I think it's so wonderful. And I do like, obviously with accounting, starting to account for staff travel, you are touching on that scope 3, but it's not like the all-encompassing scope 3 where we're talking about all the students and all the things. You're just getting started. And I think that that's really important, not unlike what I sort of alluded to before. I'm like, there's a lot in the CANIE Accord that I think can improve, and we'll continue to work on that over time. But what we want is to bring people along with us on that work and keep that momentum going. So beautiful. Thank you. This next question is like, slightly existential, and I think it touches on what a few people may be anxious about, and I think it's what stops a lot of people from moving forward. So you both mentioned reductions in emissions. Zach, you talked about how you don't have everything measured yet. So you're like, oh, we committed to reductions, but we don't know where they're going to come from. And so I wanted to talk and hear from both of you, maybe then Joe and then Zach, about the importance of, like, do you already have a plan for those reductions? I know, Joe, you've got your baseline set, and wondering, you know, kind of what we talked about earlier, is it like a leap of faith? You're just like, oh, okay, well, we're in the face of a climate crisis, so we got to make reductions. We're going to commit to them publicly, figure it out as we go. Or do you like have a plan that you're just ready to like operationalize, implement, and just
Somewhere in between, I think, is the answer, CJ. So I am currently working on an emissions reduction strategy. And again, I think that it is slightly a leap of faith for those who are in the operational teams, because they will be the ones that have to implement this with support from myself and the wider sustainability team. Currently, though, I've gone pretty light touch, because I think, to your point, Zach, it's resourcing, and it's also the education that comes with it. So we can't sort of dive into all of this really detailed, complex work when I'm a team of two and our network is so big and so complex. So I've gone light touch to say, we've done some analysis on our profile, on our baseline year. Here are some of the key opportunities for us to investigate and further explore. And then, those opportunities were based on a criteria of what's technically feasible right now, what's financially viable right now, and what actually has the greatest potential for abatement. So, we've gone through this lens of those criteria, and we've got 10 opportunities that we are now I'm trying to put forward for the next 12 months, that we explore those and what they each mean for each region, because they're not going to be the same. And then also there's the other factors that are not accounted for within the criteria. There are things like, obviously, if you want to reduce domestic air travel in South Asia, in India, your options are rail or bus. Those options take hours and hours of employee travel. They're also not safe for our female employees. So there's other considerations that we have to take into account when we're looking at these opportunities. So that's sort of my light touch. Here are some opportunities. Let's explore how we can actually implement them.
Beautiful.
Does
Thank
that answer
you
your
for
question?
sharing that. No, it really does. It really, really does. And I think that Zach, yeah, that sets you great.
I guess in that one of the beauties of setting a baseline year is it gives you a big runway to figure out how you're going to actually reduce after that baseline year. So having this year ahead of us to kind of set that baseline doesn't mean we're not going to try to make any adjustments to the travel. So for example, when I'm traveling now, I'm always trying to take public transportation wherever I go if it's possible. Like, we can encourage those changes on the front end and make our baseline year even lower than it normally would be. But it does give us time. And so that how we've talked about the 10% year over year as being kind of what we're striving for after the baseline year. How are we going to get to that 10%? I think the data is going to tell us a lot in that first year. And we can start assessing about 6 months in to see, okay, what does the first 6 months look like? How would we maybe adjust that first 6 months to reduce by 10%? Maybe that'll be something we try to strive to do. But that 1 year of baseline data collection gives us time to get to the point, which I would be upfront with you on, that we have not gotten to yet, which is really start talking about, here's what each individual should and could be doing to reduce their footprint as part of their travel. But we're going to get there, I'm sure.
And I just want to recognize that I think that it's okay to not have all the answers, right? Like, and things are going to change in our sector, things are going to change. And like right now, we're sort of handcuffed in a lot of situations where it's outside of our control, or we aren't able to there's not enough, we're not at the threshold where things have like dramatically changed yet. That's what we're pushing for. So there's still some things that are kind of like, either we don't do it or either we have to sort of do it, or it's bad for business. And that doesn't help our business if we go under, right? So there's all these, and specifically CANIE, the idea is very much to like collaborate and network and solve these problems together, and sort of find, brainstorm solutions in chapter meetings and events like this on, like, we made the commitment, hopefully like we can work through and collaborate and innovate toward being able to achieve and the design strategies to achieve, given what we're all sort of sharing. And sorry, Zach, go ahead. You look like you wanted to say something.
No, I think one of the first things Joe mentioned during the session was the collective action required to tackle this. And while, it's kind of feels good to be on the front end of this, I don't think this is a zero-sum game, right? Every provider, every university, I think, should be working on this front, and that's part of the reason we're trying to do this now, is to spur on other organizations, our peers, our competitors, to be doing the same exact thing, because this rising tide lifts all boats. This isn't, like I said, it's not a zero-sum game. Because we're being more sustainable than someone else doesn't mean we're winning, right? In the world of business, I think the idea here, even though I said there's a business case for it earlier, even though I said there's a reason why we want to be doing this from a business perspective, I think there's a moral imperative that supersedes all of that needs to bring us all together to be doing this work. So that collective attitude that Joe was mentioning earlier, I think should really be central in all of this as well.
And I think one of the things that we maybe don't talk about enough is there's the collective sort of attitude and mentality, but there's also like the collective power, right, of organizations and institutions, and whether it's an international office within an institution, or some institutions within, or like sponsors as well. So there's really all these different like power dynamics, but ultimately like the collective power of our sector. I think we have a tremendous opportunity to be able to do that, and we collaborate in so much of the other work that we do. So this feels just like a natural extension of those other collaborations. Okay, so thank you so much. We've got about half an hour left, and I just wanted to shift over to stuff that's a little bit more related to service providers, but not unrelated to, because service providers have a lot of power, what we're talking about. And I think that conversation is super relevant, both to other service providers, associations who are listening, as well as organizations who work with different service providers. So there's a couple things, and this is that big conversation that we sort of had, and I'd love to hear the thoughts of the group. We don't have the answers to this, so I'm prefacing, like, this conversation comes with no agenda, but student emissions are a big, like the elephant in the room, if you will. It's we believe, everybody in this room believes, anyone who's watching this either today or later, is a believer in the transformative power of international education. And so when it comes to student emissions, we believe in the ability to have that conversation. But yesterday in the live podcast around COIL, it was, there's a real conversation around, like, where do those student emissions live? Are those student emissions ethical? But like, even before that is, where do those students where's the responsibility held for those student emissions? So I'd be really keen to hear, because both of you are service providers and have made the decision at this point to not address students as the scope of your scope 3. And I'd be curious to sort of hear your thoughts without any sort of agenda on, like, where you can hold different truths in your head at the same time. And just kind of hear maybe from you, Joe, especially because you're coming at this from totally different sector experience, and you're coming at this totally new with these like fresh eyes, and some of us have been in it for more than a decade. And so I'd be super keen to hear from you how you sort of, when you're coming in and looking at this fresh, where you see the student emissions existing, and how that model of collaboration and innovation might be. Whose responsibility is it?
So I guess, as I mentioned before, we going through and using an actual standard and framework when we developed our boundary and scope. Student emissions for us were out of scope. Where do I think they sit? I honestly don't know. So we had this question come from a board member and say, well, how come we're not accounting for it? Surely we should be accounting for it. When I explained, how we got to that process and how it wasn't within scope, he was concerned that, are we leaving it to the student? Are we saying it's a personal emission of the student themselves? It's their decision, they've made this choice. Or is it for the institutions to carry, because they are providing the education piece, which is the reason for them travelling? So I guess I don't have a straight answer for you, CJ, about who owns that and who doesn't own it. But I guess, the sector experience that I bring, and having, I guess, worked as a sustainability professional, the sustainability profession themselves collaborate a lot, which is really good. And we talk about our experiences a lot coming from different types of organisations. And I know that the aviation industry, for one, is one that's working with people outside of the sector. So in Australia, our large, the Australia Post, so our postal service, is investing in sustainable aviation fuel with our largest national carrier, with Qantas. And they've made that decision because they're obviously flying a whole lot of postage parcels around. But that's the kind of thing that's really interesting to see, cross-sector collaboration as well. And maybe that's something that that where we would like to get to in international education.
Right, like all the different touch points along a student journey, sort of getting together and sorting out what it might look like to distribute emission responsibility evenly for the purposes of accounting, so that we're not double, triple, or worse, undercounting when making those plans. And there, I don't think anyone has the answer, but I'm always like really curious to hear when people are thinking, and I appreciate your perspective sort of as someone who's just coming into this. So thank you for that. Zach, did you have anything to add, or?
No, I don't think when I think about this philosophically, we are the common, because we're multilateral. San Diego State may send 25 students, 25 universities around the world, and they're going to get actually 25 different students from 25 different universities. So it's not bilateral by nature, our programming. And so in my mind, we are the one common denominator amongst it all. And so the challenges do persist of who's measuring, overcounting, undercounting, for sure. The tools that students use to travel. Obviously, the flying is the big elephant in the room in terms of CO2 emissions. And I think it's really a really critical thing to think about is how do they fit into that? But I think we have an ecosystem for our program of students studying abroad. The common denominator is us. Some students actually don't travel by plane to travel to their study abroad program. Some travel by train because we do Europe to Europe exchange. So there's a lot going on there, of which we've never kind of philosophically said we're not going to be measuring this because we don't think it's in our purview around the CANIE Accord and sustainability and measuring climate change here. But it's just a real beast to tackle. And that's why we're not doing it yet. It's really tough.
Honestly, I'm really grateful that we're having this conversation, and Kate and Ine have some great, really great comments in the chat. Just like, it's just generally like really challenging and like really sharing responsibility. And I think the common theme, what I'm I'm heartened to hear, is that no one is really saying that's the student's problem, right? Like we are all acknowledging that, as sort of, I talk a lot about being the adults in the room, being the ones that are sort of leading our students on their sort of transformational journey. And when we also sort of add the lens of climate justice to that, in terms of justice from like regional standpoints, socioeconomic standpoints, generational standpoints. So you look at all those different lenses and you think, okay, well, I'm heartened to see that no one in this room was like, it's the student's problem. So that's really nice. And at least we know that that's one that we can eliminate and sort of move forward on. And surely maybe there'll be a CANIE working group on figuring out some sort of model. I'm pointing at like the academics in our realm, but that's a great conversation, and thank you for having it.
I think we'll have I think there'll be challenges in that conversation event. I think there'll be a lot of different viewpoints on the during program personal travel that takes place for students studying abroad. And that's, I think, they're going to travel to where they're going. Our goal is to try to get them to travel less when they're there. Like that's really with our education and communication plans that we're going to try to put in place, we want folks to stay local. And that, like, let's take the typical American student studying in Europe as an example. I know there's lots of different places, lots of different dynamics, but students are going and taking these EasyJet Ryanair flights for $90, 7 weekends during their 10-week program or 12-week program. What we want them to do is do that a lot less and stay local and travel by train, a lot more travel by bus, doing this in other countries like South Korea and Japan, Australia, etc. But that's that is something that may not feel really like you're responsible as an organization for having their study abroad program because you've gotten them there. that's on them to do the traveling. So I think that's going to be an interesting conversation to be had as part of this as well. Although I think that's the area we can do the most good, because students are going to go where they're going no matter what. Let's have them stay where they are for the most part when they go.
And that's a really interesting sort of statement too. Like, they're going to go where they're going to go no matter what. Like, are they? Like, what does that even look like if we're talking about like being at 50% emissions by the end of the decade, which is sort of all those science-based targets? Like, what is like an innovative, totally like transformed piece? So yes, there's the like personal travel within it, but there, from what I know, no models at the moment that account for that. And even just the emissions of what we know to be true needing to be reduced. What does that look like in, the next little bit? And how do we account for that? And how is that shared between all the different touch points that a student sees? And when we talk about like the scope of influence is what scope 3, this is directly what we influence. And whose responsibility is that? And so, yeah, and like you're saying in the chat, like the length of the program is an important component. Earlier today, I think it was Dickinson that was like, nah, we don't do short term anymore. We focus entirely on semester or years abroad in order to sort of reduce maximize sort of the impact of the learning opportunity abroad and maximize the impact of those emissions. And so it's really like, you're right, it's not easy. And I think that that's a really interesting point in terms of like from directly having the conversation as it relates to the measuring piece. So thank you both for sharing that space. Oh, Ine, thanks for that comment. And just for the people who are watching on YouTube in the future, I just want to read it. It says, from my perspective, there was a culture of travel being sold to students and a history of what study abroad benefits included. Travel was a huge piece of it. And so I think that's a really interesting like reflection. Where does our responsibility sit? What does our influence look like? And how do we realistically look that? Okay, so on to another thing that's unique and specific to the service provider world is conferences. Right. Of course, everyone is going to them. We know there's a lot of all the institutions attend, but sort of service providers and conference providers are sort of uniquely on the sort of service provider side. And this is uniquely relevant to people here. So Joe, IDP, and I know we talked about this before, posts the AIEC conference. And I just wanted to sort of make space for this conversation, was I noticed that there was no commitment to offering, there was a commitment to offering virtual participation options, which I think is really awesome. And I wondered if you could like tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think COVID taught the events team a whole lot on running virtual, entire 100% virtual conferences. And last year's conference was a hybrid. And I think they will continue to offer that, because even though I think last year's conference was enormous because people just wanted to get out and see each other face to face. We're not anticipating those sorts of numbers again this year because people will choose and opt into, attending the sessions virtually, which I think is a great thing, because it's something that we've taken away from our COVID years, that we can still be part of a conference and still learn and collaborate and share through a virtual means. So that will continue into the future.
Thank you for that. I think that's really great. I can only speak to myself for myself as a service provider in the past, and all of my roles. I've been a conference sponsor and service provider. And so I found that the virtual participation options, especially when they were 100% virtual, when they were hybrid, it was like a little bit more challenging to engage with people who were like there in person versus so there was a little bit of resistance to that. But I found that like as a team, we were much more effective. And it was also like so much more cost effective. And also obviously like from an emission standpoint, like had a very limited impact on our carbon budget, which was great. So thank you for sharing that. And now, not unlike the student travel scope and what was relevant, emissions from conference attendance is something that the industry is really not sure how to deal with. So I noticed on the conference side that IDP didn't make a commitment to accounting for the emissions from attendees. But then on the flip side, ICEP did commit to that. So I'm really keen to like find out both perspectives here and sort of what sharing, what the barriers were to doing it or why you did go ahead and do it. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thought process. And I think Zach, maybe I'll start with you.
we're not in the business of running many conferences these days. In the past, we had run kind of coordinator workshops and ISEP conferences, but that has not happened since before the pandemic. We do believe that if we do this again, we're absolutely going to be doing this in a hybrid way and not just have everything be in person. We run our council advisors that way, run our board of directors that way. But it seemed to make sense. I mean, if we're expecting our conferences that we're collaborating with to be taking this seriously, when we want to hold perhaps a smaller mini conference, we want to be doing many of the same things that we want them to be doing. So we know that there are some challenges out there, though. One of the things, I went to a session at the Forum in Seattle, and they were talking about trying to provide some of these conferences in a hybrid format. And right now, the industry is making that just very difficult from a cost perspective to run when you're using one of those conference facilities that's in a hotel or a conference facility generally. The technology that the cost point for the technology that they're charging to try to turn that into hybrid makes it so cost prohibitive that it would double the conference attendee cost in some ways. And so trying to find ways to work with conferences to try to make it hybrid is what we want to continue to do. And if we do it on our own, hopefully having it be sufficiently small where we don't kind of enter that barrier to entry to be able to do something like that, because the conference is so big, we're having to use such a facility that charges exorbitant amounts. But our goal is to make sure that we are, when we do host events, we're making it possible for folks to attend virtually and have it sufficiently small enough to be able to do that and not feel like everybody's engaging except for you who's attending virtually.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I have a follow-up question, but I think I'll hang on to that for a second and sort of let Joe, I'd love to hear, and I think it's important to share sort of why maybe not, because AIEC is a big deal to the group in this room.
It is, and it's a huge conference that we run each year. So I do want to clarify, we do account for the student fairs and all of the, the recruitment drives and the things that we set up in particular parts of countries around the world to encourage them to come and learn about universities. We do account for those types of events, small, one-day events, I wouldn't say they're conferences, in our Scope 3 emissions. But we do not account for AIEC at this point in time. And that's really around the boundary and scope and the span of control. So we do run that with IEAA, I always get the acronyms wrong, apologies. And they, as part of the steering committee, we don't have control over all of the decisions that are made. So obviously there are IDP members on the committees, but also there are IEAA and institution representatives on the committees than there are IDP people. So that's probably where it stood at the moment. Not to say that maybe we wouldn't look into it in the future. I definitely am interested to see what that looks like, but whether it's accounted for within our total emissions or not, I think it'd be a difficult one for me to sell, saying that we've used an international standard in determining what is in and what is out. I don't think I'd be able to say, look, we need to account for it now, but it doesn't mean we couldn't measure it just for our own purposes and look to reduce that over time.
Great. Thank you so much. And now, Zach, what I wanted to sort of follow up with is like shifting to the like problem solving and collaboration. You talked about the future and like, oh yes, maybe perhaps you could go through and do something that is hybrid, or like even I'd be keen to hear both of your thoughts on like entirely virtual conferences. I know those were like super effective for a number of service providers, but the service providers who were like, and institutions who understood that like maybe in the face of the climate crisis and advanced technology and changes in technology, that the job of a recruiter or a global partnership development person has changed, right? Like it isn't how it always was. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that. But in terms of collaboration, both IDP and ISEP signed on to Article 40 of the Accord, which states that conference providers should collaboratively offer combined events. And so I'd be keen on your thoughts just to hear about what does that mean to you? And as people and organizations with influence in the sector, how do you see implementing that? And so maybe Zach, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, I was just trying to read the line again. With the I see, collaboratively offering the events. First of all, I would say the virtual only events that we've been trying to run, that we found something during the pandemic. We found a lot of participation during the pandemic. Over time, the participation has kind of slowly kind of dwindled away to the point where when we're running some of our virtual events that we would consistently get 30 to 60 folks to join. Now we're starting to get, 10 to 15. And so it's just one of these things that's trial and error. We're seeing what people are wanting to do virtually versus before during the pandemic. People were just looking for any type of professional engagement. That was the way they were getting it. But now that there are other opportunities for potential in-person engagement, I think some folks have decided to pivot towards that as opposed to doing the virtual, or, we talked about the burnout of the virtual events. So I'm not saying that virtual events aren't something that's going to be really central to our efforts here, but it has been noticeable for us we do in-depth series and workshops and events throughout the year. And we've just slowly been seeing a little bit of a decline in participation since kind of some of the peaks of the pandemic. But I'm trying to read that line again that talks about collaboration when it comes to the conference provider. Where I see the real kind of imperative for ICEP is that if you're going to be participating in a conference, you're going to get the most out of that experience. And then if you're already traveling to an area, let's make sure that you are actually able to maybe do some additional business on the front or back end as part of that overall travel experience. But I'm wondering, because I didn't memorize that line. I'm trying to look at it again to see kind of what we've committed to on that front.
I imagine that it's not unlike the conversations that are happening. And for anyone who's listening and joining, there's a working group called the Greening Conferences Working Group, where really at CANIE, who are sort of trying to get all the conference organizers to work through and like, what might it look like for ICEP to maybe work with another conference provider so that we are getting, consolidating travel, right? Not just for us as practitioners in business meetings, like that should just kind of be like baseline practices, but what does it look like for an AIEC possibly to collaborate and collaborate with other conference providers, whether it's alternating years or whether it's offering them all in the same location over the course of 2 weeks, or like sort of that like innovative pie in the sky. What does that look like in terms of collaboration on conferences?
I guess I don't know what that looks like yet, that conference provider collaboration. I think there's a lot of room to grow there. I would say, for example, ICEP, we schedule many of our kind of larger group meetings around conferences. So ICEP France has an annual meeting that they engage in where they all kind of come together. All the French ICEP institutions, they're their own sub nonprofit of our nonprofit in a very French way. They hold their meeting right around ICEP, and we help facilitate that, or right around NAFSA, where we help facilitate that. So during the week of NAFSA, we're having our council advisor meeting, we're having our board of director meeting, we're having an ICEP France meeting, because we know everybody's already traveling for the NAFSA conference. We try to use that as kind of the gravity towards having all of these other business meetings that are going to happen no matter what. We want them to happen in part of an overall large travel component that folks are already engaging in. So, I mean, that's just a way where we try to bunch everything together to make it as efficient as possible and reduce. I mean, we would love to go to France all the time and just do these French meetings in France, but we would rather, if they're already coming here, let's schedule this for the NAFSA conference. I don't know if I have an answer for kind of the broader conference providers. I don't think we are really a conference provider. We've put on conferences in the past, I think, but we're happy to continue to collaborate on that front and see what we can do there.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I know it's one of these like, what's our best imaginary solution? And how do we like aim for the, shoot for the stars? And so thank you it's true, like everything else, there's not a lot of clear answers right now. But your commitment to at least saying, if we do go back to hosting events, like we're gonna look at this differently, I think is really important. And Joe, I'd be keen to hear what it was that made you feel secure enough to sort of make that commitment on Article 40.
Well, for me, I think it's the internal support. So the event manager who runs all of AIEC, Josephine Williams, she's passionate about this space. So when I took that commitment to her and I said, look, there's no timeline on it, but is this something that you would like to look into? She said yes. So she's been a big supporter of the greening conferences and has worked with CANIE I think she's starting now to engage more frequently, but I think she has always been part of that conversation. And for her, I think that's something that won't largely sit with me. So unfortunately, I can't give you too much detail, but it will be with her. And she's been in the event space for, I think, 15 years. So I think this is very much up her alley.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Now I'm conscious of time, that we just have a few minutes. We have like just under 10 minutes left. And I know it's been like a super active chat, which is amazing. So people haven't been shy about asking questions, and we've been answering them on the fly. So thank you to everyone for engaging. Thank you to our panelists for like also doing both things at once, and for all of our volunteers for engaging there. So if there are any questions as we wrap up, I would encourage everyone to ask any questions now so that we can get to them. But I did have one last question. In terms of like a key takeaway for people who are thinking about signing on to the CANIE Accord, is how have you managed the opportunity and responsibility of being a CANIE Accord signatory? What has that meant for sort of you as an organization and as a practitioner? And so it doesn't seem like we've got any other questions coming, so that's a sort of good place to end right now. So I would say, like, if maybe Zach or Joe, does anyone in particular want to jump?
Yeah.
Zach unmuted first. Zach wins.
It gives us purpose. It gives me purpose. The CANIE Accord has definitely given us direction, and so we all, in the abstract, I think, at the organization, want to be a more sustainable enterprise. What the CANIE Accord has given us is a little bit of a roadmap, and it's both the road that we've already traveled, that we can kind of look back and say, oh, okay, we're doing something, and we're doing some good, and then the road ahead. It's given us a pathway forward. And so without it, I don't know whether we would be as far as we are right now, just as we're not very far yet, but it's giving us, and it's giving me some inspiration and some guidance moving forward. And I think it would do the same for most organizations. And so it's a great place to start. And it's also given me something to kind of sell to my colleagues who want to be a part of this. I'm like, this is something we can commit to doing right now that will help guide us moving forward. And that's been invaluable in this process.
Yeah, I really agree with you, Zach. I also am using it as a roadmap. So I am the sustainability manager, so I do manage a program of work that of which climate change is just one area, but I have one person focusing 100% of his time really on this work, and the CANIE Accord is that. It's that roadmap of actions that we are going to take in the next 12 and 24 and 36 months that aligns to work that we were going to do anyway, and that we're pushing the organisation towards. I think it's also been a good way to bring people outside of a sustainability team into. So as I talked about, the events manager, she's passionate about a particular area. The part around climate education, our learning and capability team would love to be involved in designing a program that can build the capacity of our own IDP team members, but then also, how can we educate our students pre-departure on making those sustainable travel options, and how can they manage their waste in their new country that they're going to study in. So there's opportunities for people outside of the sustainability team to get involved as well, which is exciting.
And I think that is a beautiful place to end, that this is an opportunity for people to get involved. And as signatories, I just wanted to recognize and thank you for your leadership. I know both of you have sort of advocated for that, and with the power that you both have in the sector, I think it's really important and does help move this forward. So thank you so much for this discussion. I like that we had a little bit more time. If you have any thoughts, I think there's a survey that will be dropped in the chat. If I missed it, I'm sorry, but that will be dropped in the chat, and we'd love your feedback. And I just wanted to thank Zach and Joe, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. The process has been a pleasure. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your candor in this conversation. I know that it can be not easy to make some of these commitments and statements around the work that you want to do and what you'd like to see. So I think that that's really powerful. And thank you to everyone who took the time to join us and stay with us and share your thoughts in the chat. Now we want your thoughts in a sort of survey. So please feel free to share that. And I also just wanted to recognize all of our volunteers today, Angelo, Pitulia, Ine, as well as our lead organizer, CANIE Mavish, right now, who's running point on our Climate Action Week. Because the only reason this whole thing has been really smooth is because all of our volunteers have been able to move this forward. So thank you to everyone involved. Thank you for today. And this will be available on YouTube. And if you're watching this now on YouTube, thanks for showing up. So thanks so much, everyone, and wishing you a wonderful rest of the evening or day, wherever it is that you get.